Why the richest empire in history died poor, the Spanish paradox. August 17th, 1557. A summer morning in Madrid. The royal palace is awash with light streaming through stained glass windows. Tapestries from Flanders hang on every wall. Gold plate sits on every table. Outside in the courtyard, soldiers in polished armor stand guard over the most powerful monarch on earth. This is the Spanish Empire at its absolute zenith. They control more territory than Rome ever did. They have discovered a literal mountain made of silver. Ships arrive weekly from the New World, carrying treasure that makes other kings weep with envy. We are taught that empires fall because of military defeat or barbarian invasion. We believe that great nations crumble when their armies lose battles. But that is a lie. On this bright morning in 1557, King Philip II sits at his desk and signs a document that will echo through centuries. He is declaring national bankruptcy. The richest empire in human history cannot pay its bills. They did not lose the war. They ran out of cash. This is not a story about soldiers or saints. This is a story about the ledger, and the ledger always wins. Spain in the mid-16th century looked like the definition of success. Their king ruled territories on 4 continents. The sun literally never set on Spanish soil. Their armies were considered invincible. Their language was becoming the tongue of commerce and diplomacy. When you walked through Seville or Madrid, you saw wealth everywhere. Nobles wore silk imported from China. Churches were decorated with gold leaf thick enough to feel. The markets overflowed with spices from the East Indies and sugar from the Caribbean. Every week the bells would ring and citizens would rush to the harbor to watch the treasure fleet arrive. Massive galleons with hulls sitting low in the water from the weight of silver bars. This was not modest prosperity. This was obscene, overwhelming, almost biblical abundance. Spain had hit the lottery. They had found entire continents filled with resources, and they had the military power to take it all. But beneath the silk and gold and marble, beneath the parade of soldiers and the chorus of church bells, the foundation was rotting. The foundation was rotting. Beneath the parade of soldiers and the chorus of church bells, the foundation was rotting. The addiction started innocently enough. In 1545, an indigenous man named Diego Gualba stumbled on a mountainside in what is now Bolivia. He grabbed a bush to stop himself from falling. The roots came loose and exposed a vein of silver so pure it glittered in the thin mountain air. This was Cerro Rico, the rich mountain. It was 4,000 meters above sea level, in a landscape so harsh that nothing grew. But inside that mountain was more silver than had ever been discovered in human history. Within months, a city appeared at the base of the mountain. They called it Potosí, and it exploded into one of the largest cities in the world. By 1620, Potosí had a population of over 160,000 people. That was bigger than London, bigger than Paris. In the middle of nowhere, in freezing thin air, a metropolis of miners and merchants and priests and prostitutes materialized purely because of what lay beneath the ground. The silver came out in rivers. Every year, thousands of tons of ore were dragged from the tunnels, crushed, mixed with mercury, and refined into bars. Then it began its journey across the world. Picture the route. Mule trains carried the silver down from the high Andes to the Pacific coast. Ships took it to Panama. Workers carried it across the jungle on their backs to the Atlantic side. There the treasure fleet waited. Twice a year, a convoy of Spanish galleons, heavily armed and heavily loaded, would set sail for Spain. When they arrived in Seville, the unloading would take days. Bar after bar of silver, sack after sack of newly minted coins. The Spanish dollar, the famous piece of 8, became the global reserve currency. It was accepted everywhere from Amsterdam to Manila. And King Philip II looked at this endless flow of treasure and believed it was a gift from God. He believed it was divine endorsement of his mission to unite Europe under Catholic rule. So he started spending, not carefully, not strategically. He spent like a man who believed the money would never stop. War is the most expensive activity a nation can undertake. Philip was at war with everyone simultaneously. He fought the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean and assembled a fleet of galleys that cost a fortune to build and crew. He fought Protestant rebels in the Netherlands in a conflict that would drag on for 80 years and consume mountains of gold. He fought the French on multiple fronts. He built the Spanish Armada to invade England. 130 ships and 30,000 men, all paid for with Potosí silver. He built palaces and monasteries. He funded the Inquisition. He subsidized Catholic forces across Europe. Every decision was made with the assumption that next year's treasure fleet would cover the bills. Philip was not governing, he was gambling, and his collateral was a mountain on the other side of the world that he had never seen. But something strange started happening inside Spain itself. Even though more money was circulating than ever before, ordinary people were getting poorer. A carpenter in Castile was earning 3 times the wages his grandfather had earned. But bread cost 4 times as much. Cloth cost 5 times as much. Housing became unaffordable. This phenomenon baffled the economists of the time. For 1,000 years, prices in Europe had been stable. A loaf of bread in the year 1200 cost about the same as a loaf in 1400. But now everything was skyrocketing. They called it the price revolution. The Spanish government blamed greedy merchants and passed laws to fix prices. The laws failed immediately. The problem was supply and demand, but not the way anyone expected. Spain had flooded its economy with silver, but had not increased its production of actual goods. If you double the money supply but still have the same number of houses, the price of houses doubles. That is inflation. And inflation became a silent predator eating Spain from the inside. Here is where the curse reveals its true face. Because prices were so high in Spain, Spanish goods became uncompetitive. Spanish wool had been the finest in Europe. Now it was too expensive to export. Spanish steel had been legendary. Now foreign buyers went elsewhere. Meanwhile, France and England and the Netherlands did not have mountains of silver. Their prices stayed relatively stable. So Spanish consumers did what consumers always do. They bought the cheaper foreign goods. A Spanish nobleman wanting a velvet cloak bought it from a Dutch merchant because it cost half as much. A Spanish farmer needing tools bought them from France. The silver flowed into Spain through the port of Seville, and it flowed right back out into the pockets of foreign merchants. Spain became a funnel. They did the back-breaking work of mining the silver. They enslaved indigenous populations. They risked deadly ocean crossings. And then they handed the treasure to their economic rivals in exchange for manufactured goods. A Spanish economist of the era wrote that Spain was like a mouth that receives food, chews it, and sends it to other parts of Europe to digest. Spain was doing the work. Everyone else was getting the nutrition. This destroyed Spanish manufacturing. Why build a factory in Spain when costs were high and you could not compete with imports? Factories closed, foundries went cold. Textile workshops shut their doors. The Spanish people stopped producing. An entire culture began to look down on manual labor and productive work. If you had silver in your pocket, why should you work with your hands? The wealthy bought titles and became idle aristocrats. The poor flocked to cities to beg or joined the church or the army. The middle class, the engine of any strong economy, began to vanish. Spain was becoming a nation of consumers who produced nothing, and the king was spending money he did not have. This is the most shocking part. Philip II, ruler of the richest empire on earth, was drowning in debt. He was borrowing from German and Italian bankers, the Fuggers and the Genoese. He would take a massive loan to pay his soldiers. As collateral, he would pledge next year's silver shipment. He was living paycheck to paycheck on a continental scale. He was betting that the treasure fleet would always arrive on time, that storms would not sink the ships, that pirates would not intercept the cargo. But sometimes the ships did sink. Sometimes the silver was not enough to cover the interest payments. The debt grew like a tumor. It metastasized. By 1557, the situation became critical. Wars in the Netherlands and France were costing millions of ducats every month. The treasure fleet was delayed. The bankers in Genoa were demanding payment, and Philip had to do the unthinkable. On New Year's Day, 1557, he declared bankruptcy. He suspended all payments to his creditors. The richest king on earth defaulted. The shock wave rippled across Europe. Banks collapsed in Genoa and Augsburg. Credit markets froze. But the most immediate consequence was military. Spanish soldiers fighting in the Netherlands stopped receiving their wages. When soldiers do not get paid, they do not fight. Or worse, they turn on their employers. In 1576, unpaid Spanish troops mutinied and sacked the city of Antwerp. It was called the Spanish Fury. Thousands of civilians were killed. Buildings were burned. It was a public relations catastrophe. It turned the people of the Netherlands permanently against Spain, and it revealed the ugly truth. Spain had all the silver in the world, but could not maintain discipline in its own army. Sovereignty is solvency, and Spain was losing both. You would think this would be a lesson. You would think the king would cut spending, reform the economy, stop fighting unwinnable wars. But he did not. He could not. He was addicted. As soon as the next treasure fleet arrived, he paid a fraction of the debt, borrowed more at higher interest rates, and resumed spending. Spain declared bankruptcy again in 1575, and again in 1596. 3 times in the reign of one king. The richest nation on earth defaulted 3 times. It was a Ponzi scheme operating at the level of an empire. And like all Ponzi schemes, it only worked as long as new money kept coming in. But the curse went deeper than economics. It poisoned the political system. Because Philip had his own income from the mines, he did not need to ask his people for taxes. In England, the king had to negotiate with Parliament to raise funds. This created accountability. It created the seeds of democracy. But Philip did not need Parliament. He did not need merchants or guilds or town councils. He had Potosí. So the government became autocratic and centralized. The king tried to micromanage the entire empire from his desk in the Escorial Palace. He drowned in paperwork. He made decisions about minor trade disputes in Manila, while his army in the Netherlands went unpaid. The system was paralyzed, and while the government stagnated, the economy continued to hollow out. Let us follow the silver itself. Where did it go? It flowed out of Spain to France and Holland to pay for imports. But it did not stay in Europe either. The Europeans used Spanish silver to trade with China. The Ming dynasty had a voracious appetite for silver. China's economy was booming, but they had no silver mines. They used silver as currency and for tax payments. So the silver that was mined in Bolivia ended up in the treasury of the Chinese emperor. It was a complete global circuit. Spanish workers extracted it. Spanish soldiers guarded it. And Chinese merchants accumulated it. Spain got manufactured goods and war debts. China got the actual wealth. For a while, this global trade network made everyone feel prosperous. But back in Potosí, the mountain was dying. By the early 1600s, the easy silver was exhausted. Miners had to dig deeper into the earth. The shafts became hot and unstable. The cost of extraction increased, and the human cost was staggering. The Spanish used a labor system called the mita, adapted from Inca tradition. Every year, indigenous men were conscripted from villages across the region and forced to work in the mines. They spent weeks underground in darkness, carrying heavy sacks of ore up rickety ladders. If they fell, they died. The dust caused lung disease. The mercury used to refine the ore caused tremors and madness. Historians estimate that millions of people died in the mines over the centuries. Every silver coin that circulated in Madrid was paid for with blood. This was the hidden price of the inflation. The true balance sheet included bodies. As production costs rose and output declined, the flow of treasure began to slow. The convoys arriving in Seville got smaller. They came less frequently. Spain tried to squeeze more revenue from its colonies by raising taxes in Mexico and Peru. But you cannot tax your way to prosperity. The colonies grew resentful. They saw Spain as a parasite. This resentment planted the seeds of independence movements that would explode 2 centuries later. But before the final collapse, there was one last humiliation. In 1628, a Dutch admiral named Piet Hein captured the entire Spanish treasure fleet off the coast of Cuba. He seized tons of silver, gold, and trade goods. It was the greatest heist in naval history. When the news reached Madrid, the economy collapsed again. The king could not pay his debts. Bankers fled, but in Amsterdam there was celebration. The Dutch used the stolen silver to fund their own war against Spain. The treasure that Spain had mined was used to pay the soldiers who defeated them. It was poetic justice written in the ledger. The 17th century was a nightmare for Spain. They lost the war in the Netherlands after 80 years of bleeding money and men. They lost their dominance in Europe to France. The population of Spain actually declined. People emigrated or died from hunger and disease. Villages were abandoned. Fields turned to dust. The galleons that had once ruled the seas sat rotting in harbors. The empire that owned the world became the sick man of Europe. Other nations looked at Spain and learned a lesson. Or at least they tried to. They learned that digging gold out of the ground is not the same as creating wealth. Wealth is not a pile of coins. Wealth is a farm that produces grain year after year. Wealth is a workshop that makes tools. Wealth is a shipyard that builds vessels. Wealth is the capacity to produce things people need. Money is just a way of keeping score. If you have all the points but no players on the field, you lose the game. Spain forgot the players. They stared at the scoreboard. And they went bankrupt 3 times before they noticed they were already dead. This is not just ancient history. This is a pattern that repeats. Economists call it the resource curse or Dutch disease. When a country discovers oil or diamonds or any sudden windfall, their currency appreciates. Their exports become expensive. Their other industries die. And the government becomes corrupt because it lives off resource revenue instead of taxes. Look at Venezuela today. They have the largest oil reserves on earth. They should be the richest country in South America. Instead, they are one of the poorest. Why? Because, like Spain, they neglected agriculture and manufacturing. They imported everything. And when oil prices crashed, they had nothing left. Look at Nauru, the tiny Pacific island that found phosphate deposits. For 1 decade, they had the highest per capita income in the world. Now they are broke. The phosphate is gone. The island is an ecological wasteland. But there is an even bigger warning here. A warning for the United States and the Western world today. Spain thought they could mine their way to prosperity. Today we do not mine silver. We print currency. We have central banks that create trillions of dollars with a keystroke. We used this power during the financial crisis of 2008. We used it again during the pandemic of 2020. We flooded the economy with money just like Spain flooded Europe with silver. And just like in the 16th century, we are seeing prices explode. Housing costs have skyrocketed. Food prices are climbing. The manufacturing base has been hollowed out because it is cheaper to buy from overseas. Are we making the same mistake as Philip II? Are we confusing the digits in our bank accounts with actual economic health?